Hello, everyone. This is Dennis Schultz. I'm the Executive Director for the Blacks in Technology Foundation. If you're not familiar with Blacks in Technology, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We advocate for the promotion and inclusion of people of African descent in the technology industry. Tonight, we have Imani Nichols, who is going to talk to us about becoming a UX researcher, something I know nothing about, but I am very interested in. Imani, why don't you tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. So I actually will tell you all a little bit about me, but I just want to give you guys a quick agenda. So I know we have an hour. It will not take me an hour to speak. I tend to be very concise, but this is a very lightweight agenda. So I'll introduce myself. I'll tell you all a little bit about what a UX researcher actually does. I'll talk about how I jumped into it. I'll give you 5 tips, and most of the conversation today will be about you actually. So hopefully you all came with some questions to ask me. So it's going to be a very informal, lightweight meeting where you guys have the chance to ask me a lot of questions. So with that said, who am I? Who will you be asking these questions? So this is me here. My name is Imani Nichols. I'm a New York City-based UX researcher, and I own my own UX research company called Yzzi Research. It's actually my nickname, Izzy, spelled backwards. And I also produce a podcast about research called the Yzzi Research Podcast. And I also have a career coaching program for aspiring researchers called, you guessed it, the Yzzi Research Coaching Program. So it's nice to meet all of you. So I'll talk more about my career path a little bit later, but I've been a researcher since I've been in college. So I started doing research in some capacity in 2015. So it'll be 6 years this year, which is hard to believe. And I got introduced to research in college, and I've been hooked ever since. And I've done academic research as an undergrad. I've done market research, and now, of course, UX research. So I know we already did this for people that came in early, but can you all just type your job title and your location in the comment section? I'm just curious to see where the rest of you are from and also what you actually do. Nice, so we have some designers, a lot of designers, PMs, a full-time student, retail designer, a social worker, an academic advisor, a social researcher, a developer, someone who recently finished their PhD, congratulations. Nice, we have some students, a TV producer, digital marketing. We have Ohio, DC, Brooklyn. Nice, well, it's nice to meet all of you. Houston, hello, Danielle in Houston. So it's nice to meet all of you. So you're from a variety of places and you do a variety of different things, which is cool. So welcome, I'm happy to be here and share some more about UX research with you all. So obviously you're here because either you've heard of UX research or you want to learn more about it. It looks like based on the comments, some of you are interested in transitioning into UX research. So you're probably thinking, I've heard of that, but I want to level set and just give you all a nice high level introduction to what UX research is. So I want to start by just briefly defining who is a UX researcher. So it gets thrown around a lot. So it's someone who studies users to understand how they interact with an experience, which is usually a product. So think like a website or an app. You can totally do UX research offline, but usually in a tech space, it's on a website or an app. And with UX researchers, we're concerned about certain questions like how do users behave? What is their user journey within the product? What are they doing before they get to the product, right? What are their pain points? We think about what users actually do, think, and feel. And if you go to enough of these types of sessions about UX research, you will hear the phrase advocate for users a lot. So UX researchers, our job is to understand users' behavior in relation to our products and to make sure that their behaviors and their attitudes are reflected in the actual product roadmap and the design of these products. So we try to make sure that designers and product managers and engineers and UX writers are not designing and engineering and managing in a vacuum that does not take into account the people who are actually using the product. And so what do we actually do? So again, this is at a very high level. So we plan, execute, and we share findings from various research projects. And I can run the gamut from doing what is called discovery research. So think like user interviews, for example, talking to customers, all the way through evaluative research. And that can include a method such as usability testing, which means you actually watch people as they use the actual product and you give them tasks to complete and you assess how successful or how long, et cetera, it took them to complete the task. And who do you need to be to actually become a researcher in terms of your skills and your personality? So the obvious thing that you need here is research skills, right? So you need to know how to do interviews or focus groups or usability testing or field research, for example. That's pretty critical to being a UX researcher. But in terms of your temperament, there isn't really one set personality type that would excel as a researcher, but there are three core soft skills or three personality traits that really good researchers have. So one, we have good conversational skills. So we like to talk to people and we like to be talked to, right? So you can't have a job where your daily task consists of you trying to understand people, but not have good conversational skills. So having those really sharp conversational skills is really important. The other side of that is being a good listener. So as you're talking to people, you want them to talk back and share their thoughts and experiences with you. So you have to be able to listen critically and listen patiently as well, and knowing when to pick out certain things that your respondents say to follow up on. And sometimes when I talk about the personality type of a UX researcher, people think that you have to be extroverted and highly social. You do not. I'm a very introverted person. I love to work alone. I've actually been enjoying this quarantine. Working from home is perfect for me. So I'm extremely introverted. So you don't have to be a really extroverted, life of the party type of person to be a UX researcher, although it can help you, but you don't have to be. And lastly, the most important part I would probably say is a lot of patience. So I imagine just based on the job titles that you all shared, you work in marketing, product management, some of you are already in UX, you already know we deal with a lot of different personalities and everyone isn't always friendly or mature or personable. And so it requires a lot of patience to deal with such a range of temperaments. So this is who a UX researcher is at a higher level and what we do at a higher level as well. So what does that look like on a day-to-day? So I know whenever you ask anyone, oh, what do you do every day for your job? You always get the cliche answer, oh, it depends on the day, right? But it's true, it really does depend. But generally speaking, I pulled out some of the top 10 tasks I've completed most often in no particular order at various UX roles I've had. So writing research plans is really important. So before actually conducting a research project with respondents, you actually plan it. So you write out your methods, the budget, the sample size, the timeline. If you're doing a usability test, for example, you include the task that you want to test. If you're doing an interview or a focus group, you include a discussion guide. You plan out the project before actually doing it. And then my least favorite part of doing UX research is the actual recruitment. It can be hard to find people to talk to. Sometimes when you find people, they may cancel on you or they may have to reschedule at the last minute. It can be really hard just actually getting people to talk to you. And then of course, the most important part is actually conducting research. So let's say if we were doing some user interviews, we would actually spend quite a bit of time conducting those interviews, for example. And then, as you can imagine, these research projects yield a lot of data, both qualitative and quantitative. So it can sometimes take days to analyze all that data and make some sense of it. And then once you make sense of it, you want to share it with the team. So that team can consist of product managers, marketers, other UX researchers, designers, engineers, UX writers. It really depends on which company you're at. And then number 6 here, creating a research roadmap. This is something that more senior researchers that we do. So creating a research roadmap is a fancy way of saying you plan out the research projects over the course of a few months ahead of time. So usually you can do it like a year ahead of time, which I would not recommend, or you can do it like half of a quarter ahead of time, so 6 months ahead of time. So it shows that you're trying to align your research with the product roadmap usually. And then when you have all this research, it has to be stored somewhere. So having a research repository is critical. It's where you store all the insights, all the videos and consent forms and your notes. You put it all in one place so that you can find it and so that other people can find it as well when you're not around. And also when I worked at my last employer, I was the first and only UX researcher. So sometimes my colleagues will come to me with surveys and they would want me to look after they want me to review those surveys for them before they sent them out. So serving as an internal consultant was a part of my role at that previous employer. And now that I work for myself full time, I spend quite a bit of time applying for UX research contracts. So that takes quite a bit of time as well. And I said this was listed in no particular order, but I lied. I made number 10 relaxing, but it should have been number 1. For me, I love being a UX researcher. I mentioned previously that I'm very introverted and I'm also more of a laid back person. So I'm not attracted to high stress roles, and UX research is a very low stress role for me. But it's still very impactful. So I made relaxing number 10, but I should have made it number 1 because I'm always relaxing even when I'm working. So these are some typical tasks I complete as a UX researcher. So how do you actually get into UX research? So I guess this is true for a lot of career paths, but there is no one way into UX research, which is good because you can forge your own path, but it can be tough because there is no path before you and you don't always know what experiences or education or volunteer experiences to actually pursue to get to UX research. So I'll share my career path, and hopefully for those of you that are still students or recently graduated, you can probably get something from here as well. So I mentioned previously when I introduced myself that I started doing research in college. So that's where I was introduced to research. So I went to a university where there was a lot of research activity. So it was extremely common for undergrads to help professors with various research projects. So I helped professors in sociology and communications, in business and psychology as a research assistant, and that was really cool. So I loved being able to ask questions and talk to people to find answers to those questions, and I really enjoyed making sense out of stuff, which is ultimately what a researcher does. So around that time, I also was matched with a mentor who was an alumna of my university. And she at the time was a UX researcher at Yzzi. And so we were matched because I had an interest in pursuing research professionally. And she was the person who taught me about UX research because that's what she did. And that's what we would talk about during our check-ins every month. So I really loved what she did. And once I graduated in 2017, I worked at a library as an associate level UX researcher. And then I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I worked at WeWork for about 1.5 years as a market researcher, and I did not like it. I did not like market research. But at this time, I was interested in UX research still, but also data science. But I wasn't good at data science because I wasn't good at math, which is kind of important if you want to be a data scientist. So I had to give that up. So I didn't really like being a market researcher. And so I found another job as a UX researcher at a company called Octane, which was a fintech company where I was the first and only UX researcher. So I did a lot of discovery research, so interviews, contextual inquiries. So we worked with quite a few dealerships. So let me back up a little bit. So Octane finances power sport vehicles. So think like ATVs and UTVs. So our end users consisted of people just like us, everyday people, and also people that worked at these dealerships that sold these vehicles. So actually on my first week at Octane, I was able to go on field visits and do contextual inquiries at quite a few dealerships in the greater New York area, which was really cool to actually be in the dealership to see how they actually use our software. So I really enjoyed that. However, a few weeks ago, I decided to go out on my own and just be a UX researcher independently. And I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur, even as a child. So being able to marry my childhood desire to own my own business and also being able to do UX research has been a dream come true for me, quite literally. And also, I mentioned previously, I also provide career coaching, and I also have a podcast where I share my experiences about research. So if you are someone who's trying to break into UX research, you may be having a bit of a hard time. UX research is really hard to break into at the entry level. So it's not you if you're having a hard time. That's just how this career path is. And I don't, for the love of me, I don't know why it's like that, because what we do is not rocket science. So I'm not sure why it's so hard to break into, but it is. And with UX research, if you've applied for UX researcher roles at the entry level, you have probably noticed that entry level does not actually mean entry level in UX research. So there are a lot of associate level or junior level UX researcher roles that require 2 or 3 years of experience and a PhD, which doesn't make sense if it's entry level. Additionally, there are not a lot of internships for aspiring UX researchers. So again, I'm not sure why that is so, but that is just the ecosystem for this career. So if you are trying to break in, if you're having a hard time, it's probably not you, it's just how UX research is. So I talked a lot. So back to the comments. So I want to keep you all engaged. I know how it can be when you're listening to someone talk on Zoom, especially since you've been listening to people talk all day. I know how Zoom fatigue is. So I'll just take a break here. And I want you all to type in the comment box, type whichever number corresponds to your situation. So number 1, if you are actively trying to become a UX researcher. Number 2, if you're learning about becoming a UX researcher. Or number 3, none of the above, you're just curious. Okay, a lot of ones. Cool, a lot of 1s, 2s, a few 3s in here as well. I see some 1s and 2s like Taylor, for example. Tanya. Cool, so it seems like a lot of you, Sherry, you're a 1 and 2. Melanie, you've done UX research, but you're a 3, so cool. Will, okay, number 3, you're looking to hire me. Okay, Will, we'll follow up. Sky is a 1 and a 2. We have Brian, who's a 1. Christian's a 2. Kavana's a 2 and a 3. So we have people here that have a variety of interests, but it seems like most of you are either actively trying to become a UX researcher or you're learning about becoming a UX researcher, which is cool. So you're in the right place. So for those of you that are my 1s and 2s especially, I have 5 tips to help you become a UX researcher. And those 5 tips are here. So get some experience, build a network, do a self-audit, be honest with yourself, and hire a career coach. So number 1, get research experience. This may seem painfully obvious, but I mentioned previously that UX research is kind of tough to break into if you don't already have some research experience. So if you're like me, you are thinking to yourself, okay, well, how am I supposed to get experience if I need experience to get experience, right? How do I do that? So I have some hacks here for you. So 1 is to volunteer. I volunteer with an organization called US Digital Response, also known as USDR. So USDR was started sometime last year as a response to COVID. So they solicited the help of various technologists, including UX researchers, to work on short-term COVID-related projects. So I volunteered with them for a few months and I absolutely loved it. So I would highly recommend that. And then there's one I have not volunteered with personally, but it's very popular. It's called UX Rescue. And if you look up like UX research volunteering, there are a ton of opportunities out here, but I wanted to give you all just something to get started with without overwhelming you. And then if you are at the entry level or trying to break into the entry level, getting some contracts or being a freelancer can be really great. That's what I'm doing now and I enjoy it. But I realize that if you are earlier in your career, it may not be financially feasible for you to just do contracts or freelancing, which I get. But if you can swing it, doing that is a good way to get some experience. And also a lot of contractors work at every level. So it's not just senior level researchers, they're also entry level as well. And also, as you get all this experience, build a portfolio, right? You can do that with a Google Slides document like this one I'm sharing with you here. I actually have my portfolio in a Google Slides document. When I do my coaching program, a lot of my coaching clients, they have a website. Again, you don't have to invest in the website. I've gotten a lot of work with just a Google Slide portfolio. So you don't have to always spend money if you don't have that. So again, tip 1 is to actually get some research experience. Number 2, when you're trying to break into UX research, it can be a bit isolating and it can be very daunting and sometimes lonely. So I recommend finding some support, building a community, which is actually really easy to do now since we're virtual for presumably who knows how long. We're doing everything virtual now, so it's easy to talk to people. I've had conversations with people in Hungary, people in Germany who I probably would have never actually spoken to in ordinary circumstances, but because we're all online more now, it's easy to connect with people. So how do you connect with people? So there are so many different Slack communities out there. So I included a few here. So there's UX Mastery. There's one called Yzzi Research Academy. There's one called Hexagon UX. These are all some good choices here. There's also one called Designers for Good, but it's the number 4. And joining these Slack communities, they all have a channel that says introductions. You can introduce yourself there, and you never know who you're going to meet there also. I'm also really good for going on LinkedIn, and if I like someone's profile, I'll just reach out to them and message them. I don't always get a response, but many times I do. So that can be a good strategy as well. And also lastly, speaking of LinkedIn, joining a lot of LinkedIn groups, right? There's a few here I included. So the Insights Association, Design and Research Ops, User Experience Professionals Network. If you go to LinkedIn and type in UX Research, there are literally tons and tons of groups there. I'm a part of almost all of them. I'm even a part of some in different countries that I have never even been to. So just join them, see who's in there, comment on people's posts, engage with people, reach out. So build that network up for yourself. And then tip 3, this is more of an individual activity, do a self-audit. So take some time, maybe open up a Google Doc for yourself sometime, or use an old school pen and paper and make a T-chart, right? On one side, have your skills. So there can be things like survey research, good conversational skills, etc. And then in the second column, have the header read, does this apply to UX research, and have yes or no, and just do a self-audit to see how many of your existing skill sets, both hard skills and soft skills, apply to UX research. So that's a good way just to see where you're actually at. This can help you see, okay, should you be doing more volunteer work to build yourself up? Do you have enough skills to finesse into a full-time role? The self-audit can really help you figure out where you're at. Tip number 4, be honest with yourself. So again, I sound like a broken record. I mentioned that becoming a UX researcher can be really difficult. So you have to ask yourself, how much do you want to do this? How much do you actually care? How serious is this to you? So for example, I know a lot of people have started in market research or consumer insights and then pivoted into UX research, which a lot of people do that. Some people have gotten their master's degree in psychology or in HCI. And a lot of people have done pro bono UX research work early in their career to build themselves up. Again, and these are just some things that people have done to prepare to become full-time UX researchers. But just ask yourself, what are you willing to do? And it's also good to understand your limits. So I do quite a bit of coaching, and I've had clients that go through my coaching program and they decide, hey, I don't actually want to become a UX researcher because I don't want to do all this stuff, or I'm not willing to do some of this stuff. And that's fine. But just be willing to be honest with yourself about what you're willing to do to become a UX researcher. And lastly, this is a shameless pitch, especially now that I am a full-time entrepreneur. Again, shameless pitch. Hire a UX research career coach like myself, who's actually been through this process of trying to break into UX research. Someone who's done so many interviews, and still, as someone who now is a contractor, is always interviewing, I can actually help you prepare yourself for these UX researcher jobs. So for example, through my program YRCP, I can help you with your resume, your cover letter, your professional brand as a researcher, because you definitely do need one, your portfolio. I do a mock interview with you, LinkedIn. We actually go over some job descriptions that you submit with your application, and we analyze those during our sessions as well. So you can actually pick out what they actually mean, because sometimes these jobs say they're asking for A, but they really mean B, but there's no way for you to know. So I can help you with that. So again, shameless pitch. Hire a UX research career coach to help you get set up and build your confidence and your actual deliverables to prepare for these types of roles. And then lastly, so I included some QR codes here to find me on the internet. You can follow up with me via email, which is up here at the top in the header, hello@yzziresearch.com. And then I also included, again, some codes here. You can take some pictures of it with your phone for the coaching program, the podcast, and also my company's social media accounts. I don't post too frequently, so I'm not the type to spam people, but you can follow me there if you would like as well. I post tips and advice there also. So I promised that I wouldn't speak too long. I wanted to leave the latter half of this time to answer your questions. So we can do either chat, we can do the Q&A box.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to ask a question directly, just raise your hand. I'll unmute your mic. And we do have one question, looks like, in the Q&A.
Yeah, and Brian asked, do you have digital research repository suggestions? Yes, so I used to, when I first started at one company, I used Airtable, which I thought was great. I love Airtable. However, I found that Airtable is harder for some people to use. So using a Google Sheets document is sufficient as well. And Joy asks, although a resume can more than often substitute as a UX researcher's portfolio, portfolios are still required for many job interviews. How would one build an entry level, junior level portfolio when your paid research projects are all legally under wraps with NDAs, et cetera? Good question. So I've had that issue a lot personally in my career. So usually with NDAs, they usually protect the data, or if you have like some kind of prototype or wireframe that was protected, that's usually what the NDA protects. You can actually talk about your research methods, generally speaking. If you want to be safe, I've actually followed up with people that I've worked with to say, hey, I want to talk about this in my interview or put X, Y, and Z in my portfolio. Is it okay for me to do that? And generally, again, I just stick to talking about the methods I applied, and that seems to be fine. So Brian asked for any suggestions for a UX bootcamp. I have not done any UX bootcamp, sorry. Josh asked me, how much secondary research do you do? Quite a bit. So right now I'm working with the client on a contract basis, and they sent me over a lot of secondary research. So I'll be doing a lot of it for the next few months, actually. But I have done quite a bit of secondary research as part of discovery research phases because it helps me understand what's already been done. And it also helps me understand what knowledge the company already has about their users. Mia asked me what attracted me to creating my own agency rather than working in-house for another agency. So personally, I've always preferred to work alone and on my own schedule. And when you work at a company or an agency, you don't really have that flexibility. And I also don't really care for the politics of corporate America. I won't get too deep into that, but I don't really care too deep for that as well. So I prefer to work for myself for those two reasons.
Hey, spill that tea.
I don't like the politics of corporate America, right? Going to like the happy hours if I don't always feel like it, right? Always this pressure to be on, especially now working remotely, always having to check Slack and email, even sometimes after work hours. It was just too much for me. That's all the tea I have for tonight. So Sky asks, what's a good beginner project? And what software is best for beginners? I'm not sure what software you mean. So usually if you're getting started, so UX research doesn't have to be complicated. There are tons of softwares out there, but using like Google Suite, which is what I use a lot, is sufficient. So like I mentioned, using Google Sheets as a repository is sufficient. Airtable is sufficient. It doesn't have to be anything complicated. A good beginner project, I would recommend starting with some volunteer opportunities. So I mentioned like USDR and also UX Mastery. Those are good places to get some experience. UX Rescue to get some beginner project experience. Kanazia asks, are user research jobs typically contract or short-term work as opposed to a salary job at the company? There's a healthy mix of both. I've never had a hard time finding full-time opportunities, and I haven't had a hard time finding contracts either. So there's a healthy mix of both, I would say. Melanie asks, how does doing market research prepare you for UX, and what did you not like about market research? Good question. So for market research and UX, they use a lot of the same methods like interviews, surveys, and focus groups. So I think that's the biggest commonality is the methods. I would say the thing I did not like about market research is that market research is very vague, is borderline nebulous, right? We'll do all this research, we'll share it with the client and like, okay, this is good. And that's it. And I don't know what happens after that. At least with UX research, the UX research is applied to the product. It's applied to modify the product roadmap, the design of the experience. It actually has application. So that's one thing I love about UX research and not market research. Anonymous asked me, do I list being a usability tester as experience on your resume? I just put UX researcher, but if you're asking if you've been a usability tester before, sure, you can definitely list that. Sorry if I pronounced this, Yui, Yiwei, asks how many interviewees would be enough for getting the result in the research. So for me, my sweet spot is anywhere between 8 and 15. That also depends on the timeline and also your budget as well. But usually 8 to 15 gets me enough research there. So it looks like those are all the questions in the Q&A, and it looks like there are quite a few in the comments here. Are there any master's programs that you highly suggest? So I only have my bachelor's, so I don't have my master's, but I would look at Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon has a really good program that a lot of my peers have done, and they speak highly of it. Someone asked, they're a psych major in their senior year, congratulations. Do you see more people in UX with HCI or psych MAs? So I usually see more so with psychology actually, but there's a healthy amount of people with HCI degrees as well. But again, I'm doing very well for myself and I just have my bachelor's degree. So you don't really have to have a master's if you don't feel the need to get it. But if you feel like it will help you, go for it. But you also don't really need one to be successful either.
I'm going to jump in with a question.
Yes.
So you mentioned that you're doing well.
Mhm.
How much money does a UX researcher make at an entry level and then I guess at a senior level? And you
Yeah,
don't have to do specific, you can just generalities.
yeah, it varies wildly. Like for me, I always think Glassdoor gives a pretty accurate range. At the entry level, it can be anywhere from about 75,000 to 90,000. But also keep in mind that UXRs were concentrated on the coast. So LA, San Francisco, New York, which are all expensive cities. So keep that in mind too. And I would also say maybe at the more senior level, it can range from 100K to like 175K. Again, it also depends on which company you work at. If you're at places like Google and Microsoft and Adobe and Facebook, you'll probably be on the higher end of those ranges, but that's usually what I've seen in my research. There are also quite a few salary reports out there dedicated to UX research where you can get some more data.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So Joelle asks, how long does a UX research engagement take from start to finish in your experience? So as a contractor, I think the shortest contract I've done so far has been maybe 2 weeks. And I think my longest will be 7 months. In terms of when I was working at a company, a project can take a few days. Like if you're doing some quick usability testing, or it can take a few months if you're doing some more long-term discovery research. So anywhere from a few weeks to a few months. Quentin asks, are there books or online resources you would recommend on the field? Yes, definitely. I'll probably type that to you actually. So there are quite a few. I recommend Nielsen Norman Group, also known as NNG. That's a really good resource for learning about UX research. I also recommend, there's a book called, is it The Art of Everyday Things? There's a book, it has a red kettle on the front cover. I think it's called The Art of Everyday Things. I believe it's about UX design, which is really helpful as a researcher. I would also recommend, there are blogs by, if you've heard of the company User Interviews, which is a vendor for recruitment. They have a blog. And of course, I'm going to promote myself. I have no shame, which is Yzzi Research. I have a free podcast as well, where I share a lot of information about research also. So I have another question here about the job market. How competitive or saturated is the job market? I understand it's hard to get your foot in the door, but what about after that? So once you're in, you're in. Like now that I'm actually in the UX research space, I find that there are a lot of opportunities out there, and I don't struggle to find good fits for myself. So it may be tough to get in, but once you're in, there's plenty of UX research to go around. Yes, The Design of Everyday Things. Thank you. That's the name of the book by Don Norman. Yep, and there's also someone posted a link in the chat section, uxrsalary.com. That's a good resource too for salary insights. I've actually used that site as well. So do you all have any other questions? We still have about 20 minutes left. If you have anything else you want to ask me about UX research.
So let's talk about your rates. How much do you charge typically for an engagement?
Yeah, it varies a lot. Usually between 65 and 75 per hour.
Okay. And is that
Jordan
typical
asked,
industry rate or?
so I have no idea. So in terms of all the salaries that you'll find, all the salary research, it's more for at the full-time level. There isn't a lot of data out there about the hourly level. So a lot of it is just based on information I've gotten in these interviews in terms of what range they're offering. So that's how I determine my rates.
Okay. I'm trying to decide what I'm gonna do for my daughter because she needs to do something. And this sounds interesting. I think she actually might be encouraged by this one.
Yeah, and also tell her to email me. You have my email. She can definitely reach out. And Jordan asked, what was my favorite study I've done? My favorite study I've done. So I did a fellowship with the city of New York as a UX researcher, which I found through that USDR, which is what I mentioned earlier in terms of volunteering. And I did research with older adults in New York to see how they adapted to COVID. And the city of New York wanted to create some sort of experience virtually to help older adults be connected to different events and different services like Mill on Wheels, for example. So I've loved that one so far because that was my first time doing research in government. And it was my first time working with older adults, and it was a lot of fun working with them. Are people from Masters of Science Studies and Computer Science considered good fits for UX research? It depends on your experience. I wouldn't worry too much about your degree when it comes to UX research. It's more so about your experience, Camilla. So, I mean, I don't see why not. I don't think your educational background matters as much in terms of what the subject matter was. But I don't see why you wouldn't be, assuming that you have some research experience already. Aparna asks, can you share more about the contract process you mentioned in a day of a UX researcher? Do you also need to pursue contracts while working in-house for another firm? So I don't know what you mean by the second part. So I work totally independently. So I don't work in-house for another firm unless you're asking, do I pursue contracts while working on one? Then yes, I always have to think pretty far ahead, as most contractors do, if that's what you meant. And you asked to share more about the contract process. So it's not any different than interviewing for a full-time job. You apply or someone reaches out to me, we have a conversation. If it's an interview, it may be like 1 or 2 rounds, just as it would be for a full-time job, and they give you an offer. And that's pretty much it. You negotiate if you would like, which I always do. And that's pretty much it. It's not that different from working full-time. It's just that because contracts are by virtue much shorter than working full-time, you just have to be out there in the job market more often, but it's not really that much different than working full-time, honestly. Tonya asked, what's the best way to reach out for the coaching program? So you can either take a picture here of the coaching program QR code, or you can email me at hello@yzziresearch.com. Or you can just visit the website, yzziresearch.com. Tanya, I can put the link here in the comment section for you.
So do you have any, they talked about the good stories or your favorite project. What was your least favorite or the most challenging?
I don't think I've had a least favorite, but I would say probably one of the most challenging so far was working at the fintech company. Some of the customers, I had to wait quite a bit of time to reach out to them because once COVID happened, or once the lockdowns happened, a lot of our internal stakeholders were very hesitant about me reaching out to people. Excuse me, because remember, it's a fintech company, emphasis on the fin part, finance. So earlier in the COVID life cycle, we were unsure as to how that would affect people in terms of defaulting on their loans. So it was kind of tricky for me to reach out to them at such a sensitive time. So it wasn't really it wasn't a least favorite project per se. It was just kind of hard because I had to hold off for a few months because we didn't know how COVID would affect our business and also our customers.
And on the scale of 1 to 10, as far as how much technical knowledge you need to have to be effective, how technical does a UX researcher need to be?
Technical in terms of like engineering and like CSS, that type of thing.
Just understanding, technical concepts, basic coding, that type of thing.
0.
Okay.
But you don't really have to be technical. I'm not technical at all. And most UXRs I speak to are not. We have backgrounds in like sociology and anthropology, English, journalism. So no, we're not very technical people in that sense. There are definitely UXRs who are, but you definitely don't need to be technical to do this. And I have another question here. Do you suggest designers and stakeholders what to do with your findings, or do you strictly report? That is a good question. So I like to I present my findings as recommendations based on client conversations or based on customer conversations. Now, I've tried to make suggestions that did not go over well. Sometimes people take it the wrong way and they think that you're insulting their work. And of course, as a UXR, you don't mean it like that. We're just trying to help. But you have to be really delicate with how you share suggestions. So framing them as recommendations is a good way as well. So I do somewhere in between. Josh asked, what percentage of my work is qual versus quant? I would say maybe about 70% qual and 30% quant as of right now. But I'm sure if you ask me that question, Josh, at the end of this year, it'll probably be a different blend. But right now, I'll say 70-30. I focus more so on qualitative research. Right? Nobody wants to hear their baby's ugly, exactly. But sometimes it's tricky sharing feedback with your internal stakeholders, because I get it. They design these websites, they engineer them, they plan them out, and they don't always want to hear what a customer said about it. So I get where they're coming from, but it can be tricky in terms of sharing the insight sometimes. Andrea said that UXR is a human expert. Yes, totally. Do you all have any other questions that you wanted to ask me while you have me here for the next, I think, what, 14 minutes, 13, 14 minutes?
And we don't have to use all the time, but if you guys do have questions,
Yeah, Angie did ask a question. Angie Brown asked, is there a difference between UX researchers and UX designers? Yes, so UX researchers, we just do research in terms of like focus groups, usability testing, actually talking with people. UX designers actually design like the interfaces and the actual visual element of the experience. You have a lot of people that do both, that are researchers and designers, and you have people like myself that only specialize in one. So I only do UX research because a lot of people only do one or the other, but the designers do things like they create the prototypes and the wireframes, and they create the actual user flow. And the UX researchers, we do the research, we talk to people, we validate the user flows, we test the concepts, we do things like that. So that's the big difference, but there are some people that do both. Anonymous asks, what constructive or negative feedback have I needed to give to a stakeholder or customer? That's a good question. That's a really good question. I definitely have had situations. I'm trying to think of one. When I was working on the fellowship with the city, we got some feedback from the end users, the older adults, that it wasn't always clear if the events were free or not. And that wasn't really negative feedback, but it was just constructive. And this is one of the things about UX research. When we are designing and researching and product managing and engineering, we don't always think about the user, which is why UX research is so important. So in that case, it was obvious to us that these events were free, but it wasn't always obvious to the older adults that we tested with. So that was some constructive feedback, was to make the details of these events a little bit clearer. And again, it wasn't really negative feedback, but it was constructive, and we did take their advice.
Hi, Imani. This is Joel. Dennis got me to get off mute so I can ask my question. But do you find, and again, thank you for the presentation. It's very helpful. I'm in the UI UX industry right now as a senior UI UX designer, and we're actually we're interested in UX researching for a couple of projects that we're working on. But do you find that the stuff that you're actually doing research on and providing feedback for, are you working on projects that are already completed, or are you actually researching and providing feedback on wireframes and kind of the workflows that haven't yet been implemented? So is it really what I'm asking, are you doing research on before the app is built or after the apps are built?
Yeah, like how much discovery research am I doing as opposed to how much evaluative? A little bit of both. I personally, over the past few months, I've really fallen in love with discovery research. So let's say before a web or an app is built out or before it's shipped. So maybe there's just a wireframe, for example, or a lo-fi prototype. And just I like doing user interviews at the discovery phase, but I do some evaluative research as well, mostly usability testing, but mostly I focus on like that discovery research phase, at least right now. I mentioned this in my answer to another question earlier. If you ask me this by the end of this year, you'll probably get a different answer, especially now that I'm doing contract work. But right now, say I'll do mostly discovery research. There
Okay,
was
and then
another question here, a few questions actually. I think this Michael asked, how do you measure success after the fact? That's the golden ticket question in UX research. I have no idea. If you ask any other UX researcher, we won't know. We really don't. It's really tricky, especially for those of us who are qualitative researchers. How do you measure the impact of the insights from an interview? Who knows? Like, it's hard. It's really, really hard. That's probably one of the hardest parts of being a UX researcher, is measuring the success of the UX research. So that's something I'm still that's something that still challenges me right now. So I'm sure it does for a lot of researchers. I've even had this question, I've asked this question of a lot of senior researchers and they didn't really have an answer either. So it's a hard thing to measure. Do you ever have issues with clients not wanting to share that kind of data? Not really. Clients usually, since they do hire me, they are open to sharing data with me. So I haven't had that issue. Deidre asks, have you had any unique challenges in this industry as a young African-American woman? No, I haven't. So far, to my understanding, I don't know what the demographics are of being a UX researcher. Most of my peers have been white that I've met. So I do assume that the industry does lean more to that in that direction racially. However, I haven't had any issues. The overwhelming majority of people I've reached out to have been very pleasant, very helpful. I'm really fortunate. I haven't had a lot of tension. I've had a lot of support from people that are also Black and not Black as well. So it really I haven't had a negative experience in terms of being a young Black woman as a UX researcher. It looks like Jordan recommended some programs, University of Michigan, UT Austin, UC Irvine, Berkeley. And it looks like that's it in terms of the questions. So you're welcome, everyone. This was nice. Thanks for all the good questions. Hopefully they were helpful. And again, you can reach out to me via email here at hello@yzziresearch.com. You can also find me at yzziresearch.com. And you can also learn more about the coaching program and the podcast there. And I also have social media accounts here as well. So you can always follow up with me. I'm also on LinkedIn, Imani Nichols. I'll type my name so you can find me there as well. And you can connect there and you can talk there too. It may take me some time to get back to you, but I will try my best. I will get back to you, but it may take a few days. So you can always just follow up with me if you want to learn more about any of my services, or if you have more questions that you did not want to ask in front of other people, that's fine too. Cool, Deidre. You have a little Izzy at home too. And it was nice meeting all of you, and you can all have a good night. So Dennis, I don't know if you had any housekeeping stuff to wrap up with.
No, you did perfect. Thank you very much. I appreciate you and your time, and thank you for everyone who joined. It is always a pleasure to have everyone participate in our events. Be sure to check out our events page on the Blacks in Technology Foundation website for future events. We have events throughout the rest of the month and into March already scheduled. So we look forward to seeing you in the future, but have a good night and we'll post this recording soon. Take care, everyone.
Good night, everyone.